So the training we're working on today is the behavioral health assessment. Next week, many, maybe all of you will be attending the individual recovery planning workshop. We're not going to get into that today, but I will mention the IRP a little bit as we go along. There is a reason that I use this illustration. Those of you who have been through this training before are familiar with this Dr. Seuss illustration, "Oh, the places you'll go." And I chose that illustration on purpose. It may seem silly, but the behavioral health assessment and the recovery planning process are about helping our clients determine the future that they hope to achieve, and then figure out how to help them get there. In much the same way, our little character here in this Dr. Seuss book talks throughout that book about the adventures that he goes on and the positive destinations that he wants to reach. We'll touch on that a little bit more when you get to the IRP, but just a preview of coming attractions. So let's talk a little bit about what the purposes are of the BHA. And so there's three primary purposes of the BHA. The first is to let the client, the individual, tell their story and tell you what recovery looks like for them, or what they would like recovery to look like for them. The BHA is also about determining whether there's a need for the helping services that we provide. And there's a couple of things that you're considering there. Does the individual want or need helping services, and do they meet the individual criteria for services? And basically, the individual criteria for services is a psychiatric diagnosis that meets DBH/DD criteria for receiving services. And then the third function of the BHA is to assist the individual to develop the individual recovery plan, which respects their needs and strengths. And so the purpose, the BHA should ultimately result in an individual recovery plan that you and the client put together that addresses the client's needs and their desires for recovery. So what is recovery? You see there on the left-hand side of your screen just some basic bullet points about what recovery is all about. And recovery really goes through the whole BHA IRP process. And recovery is about the individual being the decision maker, not the professional. So it's not our job to tell our clients what their recovery should look like for them. It's the client's job to tell us what kinds of decisions they want to make. Problems in a recovery model are not really viewed as problems. They're viewed more as unmet needs that the client wants to figure out better ways of meeting, or needs that they've never had met and just want to figure out ways of meeting those needs. Whereas the opposite of that, of course, is problems are just viewed as symptoms or behaviors that need to be eliminated. Temper tantrums, fighting, lying, whatever. So recovery isn't about eliminating symptoms, it's about meeting needs. And in the recovery model, strengths are resources that can be applied to recovery, versus strengths aren't really even considered. So the recovery model is about the client being the decision maker, helping the client figure out how to positively meet unmet needs, and how to build on the strengths that they have, or build up strengths that are currently emerging. So let's get down in the weeds here a little bit with the recovery-focused behavioral health assessment. Now, as we go along, we're going to switch a couple of times from this PowerPoint to some things that I'll demonstrate in CareLogic for you, but let me go through some steps first, and then we'll jump over to CareLogic, and I'll show you how these steps work in CareLogic, because we do have a large number of folks that haven't done a BHA before. So, as I said, you'll get these slides again after the presentation. So to find, there's a very useful folder in CareLogic that I'll show you some contents of here in a minute. But this is your way to get there. So from the client's ECR, if you go down to assessment documents and scroll down to that BHA IRP with integrated care download folder, you'll find a variety of templates and tools for use in assessment. And I'll show you those in a minute. So these are just the steps in getting the behavioral health assessment started. So of course you're going to schedule the same way you would with any other appointment. You need to make sure that prior to scheduling the BHA that you've reached out to your referral source or whoever else provided information concerning this client to make sure you have any background information that you need. If this is a reassessment, you'll want to make sure that anybody who's working with the client has provided you some background on what they've seen as they've been working with the client. You'll want to complete, of course, the BHA, whether it's an intake or a reassessment with the client. And that's very important. So hear me say this. The client always needs, I know that this seems probably like a no-brainer, but you know, sometimes if you're working with child and adolescent clients, you may think, oh, it's okay, the parent's here, I can do the assessment with the parent. No, you always have to have the client present as part of the assessment process. At the assessment, you're going to create an individual recovery plan, or you're going to update an individual recovery plan if this is a reassessment. You need to get all intake paperwork signed, and I'll show you what that is. You'll need to get it signed at intake and at least annually, but we suggest that you do it anytime you do an assessment. So if you do a reassessment at 6 months, you wouldn't be making a mistake if you had the client sign new paperwork. Anytime the individual recovery plan changes, so typically at intake and at reassessment, you need to get a plan of care and treatment consent signed. You need to fill out the appropriate survey. There's a primary care physician form that has to be completed, and you need to complete service orders. And like I said, I'll show you all this stuff here in just a minute. So and you know, some things to keep in mind. This is a slide to reference later. If you can keep this in your memory, that's great. Don't feel like you have to right now. But the BHA and the service plan development, which are activities that you're going to be doing at an assessment, are billed in 15-minute increments, and they're billed only for time spent face-to-face with the client. So there's no time that you can bill that where the client is not present. So the client always has to be present in order for you to bill. And the way those units work, 15-minute units. So once 8 minutes has ticked by on the clock, between 8 and 15 minutes equals a unit. There's some complicated math there. The bottom line is the time that you bill, that you put on your schedule for that appointment, should be the actual amount of time that you spent with the client, and should be at the time that you spent that time with the client. So if you saw the client from 8:30 to 10 o'clock, that's what you're going to put on your schedule. If you saw the client from 8:30 to 10:45, that's what you're going to put on your schedule. There are some specific limitations or boundaries for each of the payers that we work with. So Beacon and AmeriGroup allow 90 minutes for a behavioral health assessment and 30 minutes for a service plan development. And then you can see WellCare and CareSource, a little bit different configuration of time, 75 minutes for BHA and 45 for service plan development. And Simpatico allows 2 hours for BHA, but they do not have a code for service plan development. So again, keep these slides on hand as a reference when you start scheduling behavioral health assessments. So these are the steps for actually scheduling. If you've scheduled appointments in CareLogic already, most of this is old hat to you. It's the same with any other appointment. You're going to click Kept, Submit and Continue to Document. You're going to select the right document. I'll show you what that looks like here in a second. Select whoever is your second signature. We'll get to that. And click Submit. You're going to use that green plus button to add documents because the BHA is a document group, and so there are several documents that you're actually completing when you're doing a BHA. Your first document that you're going to add is either the BHA with CANS or the BHA with ANSA. And once you've completed it, you're going to sign it and send it to whoever is the person who co-signs your BHAs. I'm going to stop and answer this question real quick. Rebecca has asked a question about whether you need to be in front of the client for service plan development. And the short answer to that is yes. Any service that you bill other than a collateral contact service, any service that you bill can only be billed if the client is present. When we get to service plan development, I'll expand on that answer just a little bit. If I forget to, Rebecca, please remind me to do that. Okay, so here's the more steps. Your second document is going to be intake survey or the mid-survey for reassessments. Make sure you select the appropriate survey because you can select both or neither, and you need to select at least one. Complete it with the client if at all possible. You don't need to send that the surveys for second signature. Your third document is the PCP information form. Also, I would strongly recommend that you complete it with the client because it asks for information in there that you can only get from the client. So if you don't think about it till later, you're not going to be able to adequately complete that, that form. So the fourth document is service orders. You should always complete service orders. It's a required form in the BHA document group. You need to select all the services that are going to be included in the IRP and sign and select the same second signature for service orders. So service orders must be signed by somebody who's fully licensed. So those are always going to require a second signature. And then you have a few additional optional screening tools, which we won't go over in detail today, but I'll show you where they are and what they look like. So here's your slide on signatures. All staff have to have BHAs and IRPs co-signed until you're notified either by our quality assurance manager, which is Samantha Chaplin, our director of substance use services, which is Anna Fortune, or me, the clinical director. Samantha Chaplin should be selected for all adult and child mental health intakes. and a fortune, and this is a change for those of you who have been sending BHAs and IRPs to me, you should now be sending those to Anna Fortune if the client has a substance use diagnosis. If you will, please, and I know sometimes there are some glitches that don't allow this, but make sure that all the documents that need a second signature, BHA, IRP, service orders, are sent to the same person. It just makes it easier for the person that's signing those documents if they can sign all of them at once and don't have to wait for some other second signer to sign documents. And again, make sure substance use diagnosis, those go to Anna Fortune. You don't need to send the service plan development note for second signature to anyone. Okay, so let me see if I can jump over here to CareLogic real quick. Hopefully it hasn't yet. Okay, it's logged me out. Let me log back in real quick. Be a little bit of a delay here. Okay, and you'll notice I'm using Google Chrome. Both Chrome and Internet Explorer are useful browsers here. Okay, so let me skip over to my schedule, and I'm going to take you through those steps, and I'm going to do this very quickly, so stop me, or rather ask questions if I'm going through this too fast. I already have one on my schedule here. Let me go ahead and schedule another. So typically in this list, you would have anybody that's on your caseload would populate in this list. Right now, I don't have that luxury. You're going to select a client program. For this one, we'll select mental health. And so depending on what you're doing, you may either be selecting behavioral health assessment. If this is an intake, if it's a reassessment, you want to select reassessment. And then we also have BHA with trauma assessment, which doesn't get used as often. They all, except for the trauma assessment, use the same document. So I'm going to say 7:30, let's say, to 9 o'clock is what I've scheduled this client for. And I'm going to submit. And you will see this little soft warning. The activity you are attempting to schedule is not on the client service plan. That's because this client doesn't have a service plan yet. So I'm going to schedule it anyway. And then I will also schedule, and I'm not going to go through this document, but just to show you how this works. We'll also schedule a 30 minutes of service plan development. And again, you'll get this soft warning. Make sure that you pay attention to these soft warnings. And if you're okay with scheduling anyway, you can go ahead and do that here. Okay, so in this case, I'm going to mark this appointment as kept. Submit and continue to document. And so this time I'm going to select the BHA with ANSA IC. So that's our adult assessment. Submit. So the first thing you're going to have to do is select somebody for second signature. If you know that this is a client with substance use, you'll select Anna Fortune. Otherwise, you will select Samantha Chaplin. We'll go ahead and submit that. So then to start adding documents to this group, you're going to click on that green plus sign. The first document that you'll add, BHA with ANSA IC. That's what that document looks like. I would suggest you go ahead and add all the documents that you're going to need. So we're going to say that we said this was an intake. So I'm going to add my intake survey. And I'll come to those questions that I see popping up there in just a minute. I'm going to add service orders. And I'm going to add the PCP information form. So those are typically all the documents that you'll be adding. Okay, so that's the process of adding the documents. I'm not going to demo any more beyond that at this point. Let me show you with John Tester here a couple of other things that I promised. So when you're doing an assessment, you have a couple of options for completing all the other documents that need to be completed with an assessment. So you can either do this intake documents group, you have an adult group, and you have a CNA group. Let me just click on the adult group. You can see that some of them have been added. I'm not going to click that add button. We'll open one that Brittany added a while back. And you'll see in here, same as with that BHA document group, all the documents that need to be completed with the client at intake or at any assessment. And these are the electronic forms that the client can sign electronically. Each of these documents can also be added individually rather than in a document group. And if you look here, I'm showing you this for a reason. You can see all the forms. You can see where it says required. So at a minimum, these are the forms that must be completed. You should also have access to paper versions of all of these documents, and you need to make sure that your intake paperwork gets completed. Anything that's required needs to either be completed electronically through CareLogic or on a paper form and scanned into the client's ECR. Okay, the last thing I'm going to show you here, and then we'll jump back to the PowerPoint and we'll see what questions we have. This folder is your friend. So this links to, let me see if it's going to, I always forget this doesn't work so well with Chrome. I'll come back to that one here in a minute. Okay, so let me see what we have here in questions. Okay. Okay, it looks like all the questions have gotten answered, so that's cool. Okay, I'm going to log this into. Okay, let's jump back into, actually, since that's, okay, let's jump back. Okay, so I'll show you this before we're done, that download folder. That's where you're going to find templates for a bunch of stuff. And I've showed you this. Just wanted you to have this in the slides too, but this is, again, you're seeing all the forms that are required. So let me do another poll here real quick, again, just to kind of figure out who all we have on here. Okay, let's see if I can get to the next one. Okay, here we go. Okay, so the next question is, what kind of assessments do you or will you be completing? And so you've got options between, and I'll put it up here, adults, child and adolescent, or substance abuse, and you can select all that apply. Okay. So it looks like almost everybody is doing child and adolescent, and then we have some of those folks doing substance use and some doing adult assessments. Okay, thank you so much. I appreciate that. So I know what to emphasize as we go into this next piece here. Okay, and there's a question about the EPAD. I'm not going to answer that in this presentation. Many of you, I'm sure, have EPADs, the signature pads to sign those electronic documents. So your best bet to follow up on that is with Brittany Angel. And typically it's a problem with making sure you have the right software installed. So when you get the EPAD, you should get some explanation on how to set that up with your system. So at this point, we're going to go into parts of the BHA, and I'm going to keep an eye on time because we are going to get through this quick. So something to keep in mind as we go, for those of you who have done BHAs, the BHA that we're going to be looking at today is the newest version of the BHA, which launched at midnight last night. So there are some new features to the BHA, which hopefully make it in some ways a little bit quicker to complete, and it allows us to get a little more in-depth information. Before we get into that, just some key things to keep in mind, and this is true with any documentation that you complete. Make sure that when you are documenting, that you document with the understanding that your client can request to read your notes, and that includes the BHA. So, you know, respectful wording, professional, you know, making sure you've got complete sentences that somebody can follow that assessment and understand who the assessment's about and what all the particulars are. Your notes can be subpoenaed, and we frequently have behavioral health assessments subpoenaed. So, you know, you need to be able to make sure that your documentation can stand up in court. And you also have to be able to justify your activities to a payer source. So if you bill 3 hours for a BHA and there's very minimal information in that BHA, it's going to be difficult to support that number of hours of billing. So make sure that the contents of the assessment support the time billed. You should always avoid using words that express judgment. You want to stick to just the facts. So commenting about how the client smells, or you're speaking sternly to the client or whatever. Make sure that you're reporting just the facts. And you should never, if a client makes a complaint about another Georgia Hope staff member, it's fine to put that complaint in quotes, but you wouldn't ever want to say something like, client's therapist is very judgmental and demanding, or something to that effect. So again, sticking to just the facts. So the BHA, and actually, let me just so you have a feel for what this looks like, and I will come back. I will come back to this, the slideshow here real quick, but let me just pop up on the screen here so you know what I'm talking about, those of you who haven't done a BHA before, what this looks like. So so what we're talking about is this document itself, the BHA document itself. And so what we're going to talk about first is this whole initial section where you're basically gathering a lot of narrative information. So the biopsychosocial summary. Okay, so the parts of the biopsychosocial. The first thing that you'll see on there where you're required to put some information is this collateral contact information referral source. So in that box, basically you want to explain anything that's relevant, that sets the stage for the BHA that you're completing with the client. So if there was anything notable about the client's demeanor, they were not engaged, they frequently cut questions short, they were very friendly, very happy to see you, whatever. Anything that gives an idea of what the setting for the assessment was. Anything notable about appearance, or anything notable about the environment that might have some impact on how the assessment is interpreted should be included in that observation collateral information box. So here's just some examples that you might see in a typical BHA. And as I said, you'll get these. I'm not going to read through each one of these, but if you have information like in that last example from the caseworker that doesn't fit in the reason for referral box, you may want to put that here. Sam's defects caseworker reports that Sam gets distracted when he's upset, and you observe that during the assessment. So anything that gives context for the assessment. The reason for the referral. So make sure that you're saying who the client is, their age, their marital status, gender, race. And I know that information can be found elsewhere in CareLogic, but we ask that you include it in the BHA because frequently this may be the only document that somebody's going to, especially if a record is subpoenaed or we share records with somebody where this information is readily available. So please put that information in there. Who referred the client, and if this is a reassessment, you'll want to say who that was originally. If it's a reassessment, when were they referred and how long have they been receiving services? You would include that in the reason for referral box. And yeah, so I've just repeated myself, making sure that if it's a reassessment, you put the reason for referral in there. Be specific, provide information on specific behaviors, frequency, duration, intensity, if you have that available. Any information that gives an idea for why the client was referred is very useful and should go without saying, but one-word responses are not acceptable. Client was referred due to anxiety, depression, anger, whatever. You need a little bit more detail than that, because again, we're using the BHA to tell the client's story, and that's a significant part of the client's story. So again, here's another example. This one's fairly in-depth. Providing whatever information you have when the therapist who's going to be working with this client meets the client, it's useful for them to have this information readily available, so they review the BHA and can get an idea for where they want to start with the therapy process. So Johnny's our client here, and his father was in an accident, and that's apparently had some significant example on Johnny's behavior. So obviously you can see that's going to give us a reason, some significant information about why we're doing this assessment in the first place. So you'll see this little, the header on this one is purple. I'm going to show you this in the actual BHA, but that's purple because this is a new question in the BHA. So if the client is being reassessed, you're going to click on a little checkbox that says yes, and it's going to open a dialog box where you're going to put progress, some kind of statement about progress toward the client's goals, the client's current treatment goals. And you should always have been doing this if you've been doing BHAs already, but we don't always see this get included, so we've pulled this piece out as a separate field to complete. You need to put any input from staff that are currently working with the client, and any relevant information, changes that have happened since the last assessment. You know, client was hospitalized 2 or 3 times, a family member passed away, that kind of thing. So here's a statement, another example that would be legit to put in that field. So he's obviously made some progress, and he wants to keep working on the progress he's made, and also wants to do something about being able to sleep through the night. In the child and adolescent assessment, we have added, well, let's see, the question there used to be, is the client attending school, and does he have any problems at school? We've eliminated the does he have any problems and replaced that with, and this is required for any client that's attending school, just a brief statement about their function in the school setting. If there are problems at school, that's where you can include that information. But any child and adolescent client who's attending school, we want at least a brief statement, even if it's, and actually I've given you some examples, even if he's doing well, he's getting A's and B's, he gets along well with other students, or if there are difficulties, anything notable about function at school, whether positive or negative, we want to include that information for clients that are attending school. Nothing too new here. Family, current history, living situation. So I've put some text in red there. For family history, you want to make sure for both adult and where it's applicable, child and adolescent clients, that you're putting some information there about childhood, transition to adulthood if it's applicable. In other words, family history should be about history, not just what's going on in the client's family right now, but if there's any significant history, you know, or even significant in the sense that it's positive, client was raised by both parents in a loving home, that's important information to have. And of course, you can include current family dynamics. The field for current living situation, so just whatever's relevant at the present time, what their marital status is, certainly, who they live with, if there are any current family conflicts or safety concerns. And we've added a field for homelessness. We've asked for that information to be provided in the past and current living situation, but we've given it its own field now so that we can track some data around this. I'll show you this in a minute too. This employment section has gotten a little more complicated in both child and adolescent and adult BHAs. So you'll see some changes there that I'll demonstrate how this works in the form here in a minute. But basically for both child and adolescent and for adults, you'll have to put some information about employment. What we've added for the adult one is if the client's not employed, they also need to answer, or you need to answer a question about whether they are available for work or not. And if they're not available for work, then an explanation is required. And you see some examples there. The reason for this is that for our adult clients who are primarily paid for by state funding, our state funder needs that information. They need to know that if a client is unemployed, whether they're available for work or not. And if they're not, they need to know why. And so that's part of the authorization process. So we've added that to the BHA. And then caregiver, child and adolescent clients, typically the caregiver is going to be their parent or guardian. And you should know that going in. For adults, typically it's the adult themselves. So medical, this hasn't changed too much, but what you'll see when I demonstrate this in the assessment is a list of chronic medical conditions. And so that's what you're going to see first, and you'll want to go through that with the client to see if they've been diagnosed with any of these medical conditions. Some of those conditions have an asterisk next to them. And those that asterisk indicates that those are conditions that, if the client is in agreement, should be addressed in the individual recovery plan. If the client does not want to address those conditions, then make sure that's noted in the behavioral health assessment. This also helps us with population management, knowing if we have clients that have diabetes, there may be specific ways that we need to follow up with clients with diabetes, for instance. So we want to be able to pull that piece out of CareLogic. Any other medical history should explain chronic illnesses that aren't explained. If the client says they have high blood pressure, you don't really need to explain that further. But if a client says that they've had a traumatic brain injury and you've checked that off in the conditions list, you'll want to explain that. Any other illnesses, injuries, developmental concerns, and that's especially important, or ongoing health concerns that aren't contained in the list that's available for you, you should explain. Tobacco/nicotine use, and we've added that at the suggestion of one of the members of our work group who was helping develop this new BHA, basically to cover there are other products out there now that contain nicotine but may not necessarily be tobacco. I'll show you how this works in the assessment itself, but the main thing to keep in mind here is if a client says that they use tobacco or nicotine products, you also need to address the question of whether they would like assistance with cessation of tobacco or nicotine use. And when you're in this medical section of the biopsychosocial, be thinking about goals, objectives, and interventions that address wellness. That's part of who we are as a provider. You as a therapist, or our CSSs or FSSs are not necessarily medically trained, but there are wellness activities that we can assist clients with to address some of those medical concerns. And so we need to make sure that we are staying aware of that. And I've provided in the BHA now a way to remind you of that we'll get to in just a little bit. Client medical history, the continuation there, if they're taking any medications, you're going to indicate that in the BHA. If at all possible, and that should include any kind of medication, not just psych meds. If at all possible, if you can get dosage of medications, an approximate date when those medications started, and who prescribed those medications. And if the client's not taking the medications as prescribed, you want to make a note of that too. There's a modified field now for allergies. This includes not just medication allergies, but any allergies. So you'll want to ask the client about that. Again, we're about wellness, and there are ways that some of these situations may be able to address from a wellness perspective or by our medical staff. So we want to make sure that we are including that information about allergies. And if there are problems with medications, most definitely make sure you ask that question. If a client has had an allergic reaction, or they don't like the way a certain medication makes them feel, or they've overdosed on a medication in the past, make sure that information gets into the BHA. You'll also, if there's any significant family medical history, there's a field for including that as well. The hospitalization section. So keep in mind, when you're thinking about hospitalizations, you're thinking about emergency room visits or hospitalizations for any reason in the last 12 months. And any reason includes both physical and medical reasons, as well as mental health. So you want to ask the client if they've been hospitalized in any setting or to an emergency room, over the last 12 months. So this gives us some idea of how to provide treatment to the client. It gives us an idea of their level of need, if they're using or overusing the emergency room as sort of a primary care. That gives us some information about something that we can address on the skills level in treatment. And it also gives you the opportunity to put information in there about psychiatric hospitalization. And this also helps us know where to request records. So make sure that you have releases of information signed for any places where a client's been hospitalized. And this will also help with tier selection. We'll talk about that here towards the end in a little bit. So approximate time frame, 30 days, 6 months, 12 months. Doesn't need to be more specific than that. And explain the reason why for the hospitalization. A couple more fields in biopsychosocial, and then we'll jump over there and I'll show you what it looks like in the actual form itself. Okay, and let's see here. We've had a question that's popped up. Yeah, okay, so would problems with medication related to overdose include attempted overdose with over-the-counter medications? That's a great question. So there's a couple of places that you would hit that. If the client was hospitalized due to an overdose with an over-the-counter medication, certainly you would indicate that under the hospitalizations section. And that would probably be the most appropriate place to list that, rather than in medical history, unless that hospitalization was more than 12 months ago. You would also potentially list that when we get to the suicide risk formulation and the questions about suicide. You'd probably have some information about that there too, if this was a suicide attempt. And if this is a situation where over-the-counter medications are being used or misused, you may also be answering or adding that information in the substance use assessment piece of the BHA. So hopefully that answered that question. So you have a section in biopsychosocial to include some brief information about the client's previous history of mental health or substance use treatment, outpatient, inpatient, and any time in the past, if they've seen a counselor in the past, if they've been hospitalized in the past, if they have received any kind of mental health or substance use treatment in the past, you want to include that here regardless of how long ago it was. And if at all possible, approximate dates, or 5 years ago, 10 years ago, approximately 1999, just something that gives an idea of how long ago that treatment was and how they responded to the treatment, positively, negatively, thought it was useless, thought it was helpful, whatever. Briefer section for family mental health history. So you'd want to say, relationships with the client, mother reportedly has a diagnosis of depression and may have had counseling in the past. Father has had a diagnosis of unconfirmed post-traumatic stress disorder. Again, this just gives you a context and a feel for where this client comes from, what their story is, and how that might affect the treatment that's being provided to them and the planning that we're going to do with them as part of the individual recovery plan. Medical relationship status, I have updated that field so that you don't even have to select anything there, but it's always going to say evaluation and treatment. And that's part of our status as an integrated care provider, and I'm not really going to go into an explanation of that at this point. So let me jump over then at this point to the BHA itself, and let's see here. Okay, good. We've got Internet Explorer. Let me just, I'm going to backtrack here just a second and show you that folder where you have templates, you have some tools that you can use. So assessment documents. So what this does is links you, and you're going to have to go through this extra step. Open this content in a new window. This links you to a company Dropbox folder. And in this Dropbox folder, you're going to see a variety of subfolders. So some of these, what you have here are, in this top level folder, you have the ANSA manual, CANS manual, which is great. And I would strongly recommend that you use that the first time you do the ANSA CANS. You've got some forms that can be used at assessments and paper forms. Recovery-oriented, a recovery-oriented strategy for going through ANSA CANS questions. I'll reference that later. Crisis Safety Plan Toolkit. And then in this subfolder, there are a variety of templates. So you have the entire BHA, both the ANSA and the CANS versions, in Word document format, so that if you don't have an internet connection, you can do this in a Word document. You also have the surveys, intake survey for both adult, child and adolescent, the reassessment surveys. You have the PCP information form in a template. And you have a template for the individual recovery plan in here. So these are documents that I would recommend that you download, have them available on your hard drive so that if you need an offline version of the assessment and IRP, you have that. Okay, so let's go back over here and I'll take you through. And what I'll do is I'm going to show you briefly the child and adolescent biopsychosocial. And I'm going to do this quickly because I want to respect your time and I want to get through all of this information today. And we have a lot here. But you'll have as a reference this video, and you'll also have the PowerPoint to take you through the steps here. So this is all pretty much self-explanatory. Anything that's pink is a required field for those of you who haven't done this before. This is that new field that I mentioned. If this is a reassessment, you're going to provide the explanation of progress there, and you have this prompt that tells you all about that. Child and adolescent, if the individual attends school, you got a drop-down list of school names. If you don't see this child's school on there, you have an other option, and you can also let us know and we can add school names to that list. The field for how does the child function at school. Family history, current living situation. This is the homelessness field. You have 3 options there. No risk at this time. May be homeless in the next 3 to 6 months or is currently homeless. If this is an older child who's employed, you click yes. You'll need to complete some information here. Number of hours that the child works a week, approximate hourly wage, and what's their occupation. If you don't see it on this list, we can add it, but if you select other, it gives you a little box to just put a brief explanation there. This is the list of chronic medical conditions, so you want to make sure you go through that with the client. If they don't have any of those and you select no, that disappears. You select yes, make sure you put something in here. I know it has a none option there. That's because this is a list that gets pulled into other notes and they need a none in that, in those other situations. And so if you select something like, I think I mentioned traumatic brain injury, which I don't see on this list right now. It's avoiding me for some reason, or cancer or something, or chronic pain or whatever, something that needs further explanation. You can explain that down here in the any other medical history. Here's that tobacco nicotine use field. And so you've got options here that you can select. For each option, if you select cigarettes, snuff, chew, or other, then you'll need to explain how much of that product they're using each day, or if it's other nicotine, like, you know, say that the client that's vaping, you can indicate that there as well. Okay, and I'm checking on a few questions here. So, yeah, there's a question about family history. So family history, probably doesn't change very much if you're doing a reassessment. But keep this in mind, because this is a new BHA, this BHA is not going to carry forward any of the information from previous BHAs. Now, once you start completing new BHAs in this new BHA, it'll carry forward to the next one, but this won't carry over from any BHAs that were previously completed. So you may have to copy paste that information from an old BHA to the new BHA. Typically, family history isn't going to change, but it's very possible that, you know, new things have come to light. So don't just assume that it hasn't changed. Lisa asked a question about the info that you're getting from the BHA. Does that just come from the client and the parent if the client's a minor, or should we be reaching out to somebody else? Really, the answer to that is, if at all possible, you know, reaching out to a referral source, for instance. If a client's referred by DFACS and there's additional information that you feel like you need from DFACS before you go out and meet with the client, certainly reach out. You know, there's a limited amount of time to get the BHA completed, and so, you know, if not all the collateral information from every source gets in there at that initial behavioral health assessment, you know, hopefully we'll gather it over time through the process of working with the client. But if you know of a source of information that's out there that can provide you some additional input that you feel like you need, you know, by all means, reach out for that information. And keep in mind that that process of reaching out for collateral information, unless you're doing it while you're with the client, calling a DFACS worker while you're with the client, that part of the process would not be billable. Only what you do while you're with the client would be billable. So that was a great question. Okay, and so you see the fields here for medication. Again, allergies, any kind of allergy, problems with medication, and significant medical history. And notice those only pop up if you click on yes. Hospitalizations, if the client has had a hospitalization, again, you see your selections here, and it's hospitalization for any reason, ER included. You're going to provide hospital type of hospitalization, why they were hospitalized, and you can add up to 4 hospitalizations here within the last 12 months. They've had psych history, substance use history. Make sure you include that information, family history. And here you see that evaluation and treatment option. Now let me swap out for just a second and take you over here to the adult BHA, which is very similar. The only thing that's significantly different between this section of the adult and the child and adolescent BHAs is the school question, which is not in the adult BHA. And the employment question is configured a little bit differently. So with an adult, if yes, occupation, hour, numbers worked, number of hours worked, and wage. If no, you're presented with this option. Are they available for work? If yes, fine. If no, you need to provide just a brief explanation of why they're not available for work. Other than that, adult and child adolescent biopsychosocial are very similar. I'm going to pop this one up real quick, then we'll jump back to the slide. This is unique to ADA questions, is unique to the adult assessment. I just want to point out something here. this first question, make sure that you understand this well, severe and persistent mental illness. I'll pop the definition up here in a second. That's a little bit bigger, but make sure you understand severe and persistent mental illness does not mean a client with only a substance use disorder. So if a client only has a substance use disorder, they're not going to qualify for ADA as having a severe and persistent mental illness. Okay. So there's that ADA information. So severe and persistent mental illness means a significant mental illness. Oh, yeah, here we go. Mental, behavioral, or emotional disorder that has significant impact on function. So keep that in mind. Significant impact on function. If you have a client that has an adjustment disorder and that's their only diagnosis, they probably will not qualify as for severe and persistent mental illness. And ADA is, these questions are basically about determining whether a client meets criteria for the Adults with Disabilities Act. Sorry, I had to cough there. Okay, so ANSA-CANS is the next part of this, and we're going to rush through this part. ANSA-CANS, there's a separate training for the ANSA-CANS, and it's a really actually a very good training that's done online, and you should have, if you were hired here as an assessor, you should have gotten the information on how to complete that. If you didn't, you can reach out to me later and we can do that. The thing, and I can send you that information. So some things to remember about ANSA-CANS. This is not just a checklist. This is a structure for a conversation with the client. When you do these assessments, the way they're set up, unfortunately, they don't start out with the strengths section. We don't have any control over that, but I would suggest that you drop down to the strengths section in the core ANSA and CANS modules when you start the section with the client. Start with strengths. It's just, we want to promote the idea that that's the most important thing. Identifying strengths, building on strengths, creating strengths that may not exist yet. Key thing to keep in mind with ANSA-CANS is that there are optional scales in there, and I've listed what all those optional scales are. The one scale that's not optional in either one of these assessments is the core ANSA and CANS modules. So those core modules are not optional. The rest are optional, and they're selected based on criteria. So you see here what the optional modules are. Keep in mind that for adults, the suicide module is not optional. We always complete the suicide module for adults. So the way you'll identify those optional scales is this comes, and I'll show you this here in a second. So this comes from the core ANSA module, I believe it is. If you see an item like this that says, please complete the parent caregiver module if the score is 1, 2, or 3, that tells you what optional modules you can complete. Every one of the modules has this little button that says not assessed at this time. Be careful about using that. You only want to use that in the optional modules. If you can, it'll allow you to skip the core module, and you don't want to skip that. So let me jump out. Actually, let me do this first. Let's hit this slide first. So as you're going through the ANSA and CANS modules, you're going to be thinking ahead to the individual recovery plan. And so anything that you score as a 2 or a 3 in the strengths and the needs modules of the ANSA and CANS, you want to make sure that those are areas that are addressed, either addressed in the BA or in the individual recovery plan, or if they're not addressed, there's an explanation as to why they're not addressed. And I'll show you where to put that here in a minute. So 2s and 3s are very important. So when we're looking, when we're auditing BHAs, we're looking at 2s and 3s and making sure that those things get addressed in some way in the individual recovery plan. You need to explain all of these in at a later point in the BHA. So you're going to want to keep track of them as you go. 0s and 1s in the strengths modules, these might be, potentially strengths that can be used in treatment that you want to incorporate in some way into the IRP. And you want to at least pay attention to 1s in any other scale. So 1 indicates that there may be some problem or that it's an issue to keep an eye on. So make sure that all of this stuff gets explained. And one of the things that we've done, and I showed you that in that folder where the templates were, the individual recovery plan template, the first section of it looks like this, and we'll hit this a little more at the IRP training next week. But I would suggest that you, and this is a Word document, I would suggest that you have this Word document open while you're doing the ANSA and CANS section of the BHA so that you have a quick place to explain those 0s and 1s and those 2s and 3s. You also have a section on there to explain anything that in terms of wellness that should be addressed in the individual recovery plan. And you have this little scratch pad for abilities or talents where you might explain that stuff as you go. So keep an eye, have this open as you're going through so that you've got a place to jot some stuff down that you're then going to copy and paste either back into the BHA later, or you may use in the individual recovery plan later. Okay, so let me show you what this looks like. Well, let me show you what it looks like over here then. Okay, so here's the adult version. This is the ANSA core module. And if you haven't gone through the ANSA or CANS training yet, these questions may not make a lot of sense to you. Go through that training before you do assessment. This is, like I said, it's a really great training, and this is a really great piece of the assessment. So notice you've got this not assessed at this time. Don't ever be tempted to click that in the core module. Each one of these items has the 0 through 3, or in some cases, there's an NA option. Make sure you understand the scoring here as you're going through this. My suggestion to you is after you complete your first BHA, go through, have the ANSA manual out, and you can access it from that folder I showed you earlier. It's also accessible right here in the assessment itself. Go through and make sure that you're understanding the scoring for each of these items. Keep an eye out for items like this one. So it says if the score is 1, 2, or 3, then you're going to want to complete this vocational career module. That's the next one that pops up here. And there are several of those throughout. So make sure that you're keeping an eye on that. So that's your core module. Like I said, I suggest scroll down to strengths and start there, and then you can come back up to here and go on to the rest of the modules Notice this one in risk behaviors, it says suicide risk, complete the suicide module, the score is 1, 2, or 3. Ignore that. We always, for adults, complete the suicide module in the ANSA. And so again, you can see some more questions where it identifies optional modules that you need to complete. So in those optional modules, if you don't need to complete a module, rather than going through and scoring everything 0, if you're not required to complete that optional module, just click on Not Assessed at this time, and it'll allow you to skip through to the next module. One thing I'll say, whenever you're working with child and adolescent clients, you have this in both the ANSA and the CANS, you have this parenting caregiver module. Always complete that, regardless of whether the item in the core tells you you should or not. Always complete that. We want to get a feel for what parenting is like for any situation where we're working with either an adult who has children, or if you're doing a child assessment, make sure that you're rating parenting and caregiving. Okay. So back to the PowerPoint. So the next thing that you're going to encounter in the behavioral health assessment is a Columbia Suicide Severity Rating Scale. There's one for adults and there's one for child and adolescent. They're very similar to each other with just minor differences in the wording. Yeah, and that's let me stop for a second and answer Kay's question. Is the parenting caregiver tab in the CANS module in the CANS still to be done for a child and adolescent in a group home? That's a great question. I would, on that one, you know, parent and caregiver, I mean, that module refers to whoever the child's parent or caregiver is. And so in the context of a group home, I would still strongly encourage you to complete that scale, you know, simply to document that, hey, they have a good caregiver in that foster home or group home. But also, you know, if there are difficulties or challenges there, that gives you the opportunity to identify any of those that might be addressed in treatment. And so family doesn't just necessarily mean biological nuclear family, and it doesn't just necessarily mean biological parent when it comes to that parent caregiver scale. It's that client's family, the family that has been created around them. So use your judgment, but I would still strongly encourage you to use that scale because it's a great way to figure out if there are other needs to be addressed. Good question. So the CSSRS has to be completed with anybody that's 8 years old or over. It can be as simple as just the 2 initial questions and a couple of others. I'll show you how it works here in a minute. There's a link here in this slide, and you should have already gotten the link to view this training. This is just like a 30-minute, and the CSSRS isn't difficult. So it doesn't take long to get adept with it, but make sure you've looked at the training so you understand what the function of it is. And I've added an additional, just a 5-minute video on the first 5 questions because people get tripped up on that sometimes, and I'll show you why here in a second. Like I said, there's just minor differences between child and adolescent and adult. And if there's any risk that's identified, make sure that you do a crisis and safety plan and a crisis support plan with the client. And this is not just an assessor responsibility. Anybody that's working with clients, anytime there's a risk identified, should complete the crisis and safety plan. And that crisis safety planning toolkit that's referred to here is in that Dropbox folder that I showed you earlier. Dean has asked the question about how do we capture information for a child 8 years and younger on the suicide scale. So the CSSRS itself is not normed for children 8 years and younger, so we don't use it, but there is still a suicide risk formulation that we'll talk about here in a second that we do use for all clients. And so that's where you would capture information on an 8-year-old client. Okay, and here's what CSSRS looks like in CareLogic. Keep in mind, this is the adult version, but like I said, the child and adolescent version is very similar. This form has been updated a little bit so that it's a little less cumbersome to complete. So those of you who have done a few of these will hopefully be thankful. So you have the first 5 questions that have to be answered, but if both of these first 2 questions are answered no, wish to be dead, and have you actually had any thoughts of killing yourself, you're not required to answer any of the rest of the 5 questions. You'll skip down to suicidal behavior. Even if they haven't had thoughts before, suicidal thoughts or wish to be dead, you still don't want to, you can't skip over this section because they may have impulsively made an attempt in the past, or this section also captures if the client has ever engaged in non-suicidal self-injurious behavior. So as I said, there's a separate training that you'll view on this to complete, know how to complete this. So I don't want to do a full training on this here. But I do want to point out a couple of things here with these questions. So notice that if you answer yes to either of these in the past month or in your lifetime on this second question, you're going to have to answer all 5 questions here. And the other thing I want you to recognize, okay, and so one thing I've done here, instead of having to, we used to have this so that if you answered yes to any of these questions, there was a dialogue that you had to fill out for each one of those questions. Now, there's just a single dialogue down here at the bottom. So if you answer yes to any of these questions above, you can do all of your explaining in here. The other thing I want you to notice, or I want to point out to you, is that the way this intensity section is scored, so lifetime most severe ideation, 1 through 5, corresponds to the questions up here. So what I do is I look up here and I find the highest number question answered yes for in your lifetime, and it's this question 3. And so my in your lifetime down here is going to be 3. In the past month, the highest question answered yes, looks like is number 2. And so in the past month, I'm going to select 2 here. So that's how you select the answer to these intensity questions. I'm not going to go any deeper on that simply because there's not enough time to do that in this training, and there is a separate training available to you on that. Okay, and Christine's given me the 30-minute warning. Thank you, Christine. There's always too much to cover in this. here's where you're going to answer. There's some additional questions, suicide risk formulation. There will be a separate training on this, I believe, coming up in the spring, specifically on suicide risk formulation, because again, this is a bigger topic than we can cover in this BHA training. March, Christina's informed me that we'll be doing this specific training on this. But so let me just take you through what goes in these fields. This part of the BHA is based primarily on the clinician's judgment. So this isn't so much where you're asking the client to answer specific questions. You're gathering the answers for these questions from information that the client's already provided to you. So long-term risk factors, the first question may be, if the client has a history of substance use, they have a history of self-harm, there's conflict in their family, anything that puts them at a higher risk of suicide, you would want to list here. And that's regardless of whether they've had a history of suicidal ideation in the past. So any potential risk factors you want to list here. Any concerns about impulsivity or self-control. Again, this is based on the information that the client's provided you to this point, which is a lot of information. You'll want to include if they've had any past suicidal behavior. If you haven't asked them that question, and surely you have by now because you've already done the CSSRS, and for adults you've done that suicide scale. If they have any present suicidal ideation or behaviors, if there are identifiable stressors in their environment, so again, they probably reported something to that effect to you by this point in the assessment. Their engagement in the assessment of risk, if they are withdrawn, if they are providing short answers, if they are very engaged and providing full answers, and you want to make a statement about that here and whether the information they're reporting in the clinician's judgment can be considered reliable. How do they present? What's their mood, appearance, any changes in presentation when discussing suicide risk? Anything, again, that gives us some context for making a good determination of whether there's risk and what the level of risk is. Client status and state, these are accomplished by selecting a drop down, and they get a little confusing sometimes. So the client risk status compares the client's level of risk to the level, the general level of risk of the population served by Georgia Hope. And so that's a clinical judgment. So your experience with clients at Georgia Hope may be that you haven't run into very many that have a high level of risk. And if that's the case, then you're going to base your selection here on your experience of Georgia Hope, the clientele of Georgia Hope. The client risk state is the client's level of risk compared to their own baseline. This is where it gets a little confusing. Their baseline is always their intake assessment. So whenever you do an intake assessment, you are always going to select similar to individual's baseline. I'll show you what this looks like. But it's always going to be similar to baseline so that you can compare at the next assessment whether they've their state has improved or deteriorated from their baseline. Okay? So I'll let that sink in a second. If you have questions about that, pop them up there. You want to make a statement about what, based on the information that they've reported to you, what their current level of risk is, and you want to explain why you have selected that current level of risk. So that refers, back to that state, similar to higher than or lower than. So you want to make sure that you back up why you consider them, for instance, a low risk. You want to identify coping resources. This is any coping resources, and these are resources specific to this client, not just generic coping resources like client indicates that hey gang, I'm back again. Can y'all see me and hear me? Okay, good. Okay, am I back again? Okay, good. So sorry for that. Again, specific to the client. So potential triggers is the same thing. You want to explain triggers that are specific to that client, and specifically how can that client avoid those triggers during the course of treatment and recovery. Anytime there's a risk, crisis plan needs to be completed, and there's a checkbox in the suicide risk formulation to indicate that you've done that. Okay, let me jump out here. Second, we'll come to substance use. Let me show you. Okay, now it's logged me out of that one and that one. Okay, tell you what, I'm going to get this logging me back in. And then we'll come back to this here in a second. Okay, so I'll come back to that suicide risk formulation here in just a second while Carologic's loading. So substance use assessment, this is a part of every assessment that we do, but if the client does not have any, does not report any issues with substance use, you have a checkbox that you can select that says no, and so then you don't have to do the substance use assessment. If there is active substance use, there needs to be a substance use diagnosis. I'll let that sink in a second. Substance use has to be addressed in the individual recovery plan if it's identified, or if it's not addressed, there needs to be an explanation as to why it's not addressed in the strengths, needs, abilities, and preferences module that we haven't talked about quite yet. And the IRP for these clients needs to be sent to the Director of Substance Use Services for co-signature. Okay, so let me pop back out here. And I'm actually, rather than using the slides at this point, just in the interest of time, I'm going to take you through substance use assessment. I'll show you suicide risk, and I'll take you through substance use assessment right after that. Okay, and so here's your suicide risk formulation. And the main thing I'm going to point out here, and this is true for both child and adolescent and adult. So this is where you have that selection for status, comparing the client to Georgia Hope clientele. You have higher, lower, and similar. This is based on your clinical judgment. And state, higher, lower, and similar to individual's baseline. So this is when you're always going to select at intake, and then you're going to compare to intake on assessments that follow that. Okay, there have been some slight changes to the substance use assessment. I'll point out what they are. This is fairly self-explanatory. Obviously, if you click no, all this stuff goes away if there's no evidence of illicit substance use. So pretty simple, substances used. We've separated out drug of choice. So, marijuana, crack, and Xanax. And the favorite is what you're going to list here. If there's more than one, you can list as many as need to be listed. You want to indicate how long each one of those substances has been in use by the client. So if they've been using marijuana off and on for 5 years, you want to put 5 years. You want to put the last use for each substance. This is very important. It goes to diagnosis. If the last use was 3 months ago versus 12 or 18 months ago, that's going to inform whether you give a substance use diagnosis or not. How often, when they were using, how often, and about how much. This is, an approximate indication there. We've added this routes of administration, and so you're just going to select all that applies. So if the client has been smoking marijuana and taking Xanaxes, then you would select smoking and oral. Or if they're inhaling paint and injecting heroin, you're going to select inhalant and intravenous. Age of first use of each substance. This is a new question. Any significant life events corresponding with the use? Explain those here. So client started using meth after his wife died, those types of things. Longest periods of abstinence, a clinical judgment call there. If the client, if you said the client's only used Xanax once, but they have smoked marijuana for the last 5 years and they've gone as long as 3 weeks without using marijuana, you're just going to report abstinence from marijuana there. Individuals' perception of substance use, so how do they think it affects them? What do they think the costs and benefits are? And this is purely from the client's perspective. Effects on their lifestyle or symptomology of substance use. How has substance use affected your function daily? And this, you may add some clinical judgment information here. Clients' thinking appears to be slowed after continuous use of marijuana. If there are any legal implications, they've been arrested for DUI, they've been arrested for selling, for possession, whatever, that's what you would include here. And if the client has ever used social support in the past, AA, NA, Celebrate Recovery, any other substance use support, report that here, and don't just report it, but explain whether the client found it useful or not. That helps us to know how to plan for them as we move forward. And is there any family history of substance use? And you can just briefly explain that here. Now, I've added this statement at the bottom. If the client is diagnosed with substance use disorder, an additional ASAM evaluation must be completed. So that document has not been made a part of this document group yet, and I will notify you when it has been made a part of this document group. We're working on developing a new substance use assessment that can be used here and can also be used independently. So while we're in here, let me take you down next to the mental status exam. There have been some welcome, or at least I think they're welcome, hopefully y'all will too, changes to the mental status exam to make it a little bit simpler, a little bit easier to complete. Mental status is about mental status in the last 3 to 6 months. A lot of the information that you're picking up here, you probably have gotten somewhere else. And oh, sorry about that. And we may go over just a little bit. So if you can stay with me, I would appreciate that. This is where you're going to pick up any symptoms, though, that may have not been addressed at some other point in the assessment. We've added a section here to describe the client's affect at the time of assessment while you were meeting with the client. Appropriate, calm, flat, blunted. We may add additional selections there as we see the need. You're going to rate the client in on each one of these symptoms as applicable in each of these categories. So anxiety disorders, these are the options that you have. NA, and then if it's a recent occurrence of that symptom and it's just mild, then you would select mild acute. Recent occurrence and it's a little more significant, moderate acute. Recent occurrence and it has severe impact, severe acute. So your chronic selections are for any of those that are symptoms that have been long lasting. And so you need to make a selection or rather go over these symptoms with the client. If the client is not experiencing any symptoms in a category, you can select no symptoms present in this section and it collapses everything. There's nothing else you have to do there. But just keep in mind, if you diagnose a client with an anxiety disorder, you should probably have some symptoms selected in that anxiety section. And anytime you have given a rating on a symptom, you need to explain what that's about. If you selected panic attacks, client reports they have panic attacks every other week. So it's not enough to just say mild acute. You need to give at least a brief explanation of why you selected that symptom. And so this is true throughout each one of these sections. You have a section on depression and several symptom categories there. These symptom categories correspond with what our payers ask that we include in authorization requests. So that's why you're seeing these specific symptoms here. Mania, substance abuse, psychotic disorders, personality disorder. If you've explained these symptoms elsewhere in the BHA, you can say explained in biopsychosocial or explained in strengths, needs, abilities, preferences. You can do that and not have to explain it again, but make sure you say where in a BHA that symptom was explained. Okay. So that's your mental status exam. There's a question here, a couple of questions. Okay, good. LaShanta likes the new format. Okay. Strengths, needs, abilities, and preferences. So this is where I indicated to you earlier that you had that scratch pad. And let me pop that up here in the slide real quick. Oh, no, I don't have that here. Sorry, let me just jump back in here. So I had pointed out that scratch pad, the Word document that you're going to use to track this, your strengths, your needs, This box is strengths that are considered a 0 or a 1, which are centerpiece strengths. Good to explain those, especially if you're not going to recommend services for a client. There needs to be support as to why not. These are strengths that the client may want to build as part of treatment. So you might think about developing a recovery goal around a strength that the client wants to build. Background needs, any needs that are scored as 1, and needs that should be considered for treatment or anything that's scored a 2 or a 3. So let me go back up here to hopes for recovery. And just explain a few things here. Hopes for recovery. In fact, I'm going to jump back into our slides here because there's some examples here in okay. So hopes for recovery, let me say that first, is a positive outcome the client wants to achieve. So be thinking in terms of goals. You know, if the client tells you they want to complete GED classes, or they want to get back to work the way that they used to, or back to church, or involved with social activities with others, you know, word it that way in hopes for recovery. Hopes for recovery needs to be specific. It needs to not be just about eliminating a symptom or a behavior. And usually, if you're thinking ahead, hopes for recovery help your client frame those in terms that can be used when you get to the individual recovery plan for writing unmet needs and goals in the IRP. So you may have to have a conversation with the client to help them flesh that out and give you something that's measurable that will know, okay, this hope has been met. Okay, so again, you see the things I've already explained. Just some stuff about strengths, making sure that you always are addressing strengths in the individual recovery plan and identifying strengths. I've hit most of this stuff. Explaining strengths is important if you don't recommend services. You know, we want to make sure we can support a reason for not recommending services. Here's some strengths examples that you can use. Unmet needs. Always keep in mind that if there's a safety concern that isn't identified anywhere else, if the client has suicidal ideation, that is always something that has to be addressed as part of treatment. But you know, unmet needs can come from the mental status exam, from the substance use assessment, from anywhere else in the BHA. So don't just focus on just the ANSA-CANS items if there are other needs that could be addressed. Again, not just symptoms and behaviors. Yeah, so more explanation here, making sure that you explain strengths and needs. That's, again, what this is all about. And you've got some examples here. Consider explaining in a way that you can copy and paste it to the individual recovery plan. So that, you know, Alicia wants to go to college and needs to complete her GED. So I didn't finish that sentence. So she can complete her education. That's, you know, very excellent wording to put into an individual recovery plan. This one, Johnny rates his happiness as a 3 on a 1 to 10 scale. Clients do that sometimes. You know, you can give them a scale, and that can sometimes be helpful in figuring out how to identify a measurable need that can be met. Abilities and talents, the ANSA-CANS helps you to identify some of that stuff. There's a question in strengths about that. Here's some things to consider as abilities and talents. These are important because they may be things that, you know, you can use as part of addressing wellness. You can use these as part of objectives, interventions, strengths, or rather abilities and talents that the client can apply during treatment. So wellness, I want to jump out here of wellness always needs to be addressed. It's not optional, and you'll see that in the BHA. I'm going to show you this part because I think it's important. We've added a section here in the strengths, needs, abilities, and preferences. So this is what you're going to see now. You have to address an area of wellness, a category of wellness that you have to select something here that's going to be addressed in the individual recovery plan. But you have a variety of things that fall under that umbrella of wellness: stress management, socialization, health improvement. So you have things in here that really would apply to any client. When you make a selection up here, you need to explain in a little more detail how that category is going to be addressed. So socialization, John wants to schedule more time with each one of his family members every week. And then that's something that you can incorporate into an objective or an intervention in the individual recovery plan. I apologize. I know that we're at 11 o'clock. If you can give me 15 more minutes, I would appreciate that. And I think that we can get this wrapped up in that amount of time. And I think we can possibly update the CE certificate to reflect that additional amount of time. Christine will let me know if that's not possible. Preferences for treatment. Anything that the client says would help them in treatment, that's what you want to list here. And ask them that question, if they would prefer to work with a female rather than a male, or if they would prefer only skills building services rather than therapy services. You can list that there. Barriers to treatment, same thing. Anything that might get in the way of them being able to participate in treatment. If they don't have transportation, if their family is resistant to them getting treatment, anything that could potentially get in the way. Again, this is about telling the client's story and making sure the therapist has information that they need to provide the best treatment. I've added this, or rather split out the last question in this section into two questions. So there are two questions here. Are there any needs that are identified in this BHA that will not be addressed at this time? So a client identifies a need, but for some reason it's not going to be addressed. They have a history of trauma and they don't want to address trauma right now. Then you're going to click yes here and you're going to explain that here. So any needs, and your rule of thumb here is anything that's scored as a 2 or a 3 in the answer or cans and isn't going to be addressed, you should explain here. Okay, let that sink in a minute. Any 2 or 3 that's not addressed, you need to explain why it's not being addressed. And if the client for some reason is not going to receive services after this assessment, they're not going to receive services from Georgia Hope, then you're going to select no, and you're going to explain that here. Therapeutic services were recommended, but the client has declined at this time, saying that that their schedule will not allow them to keep appointments, or something to that effect. So you want to make sure that that's always explained. And so you have some examples in your slides for why needs are not addressed. some examples for why treatment might not be recommended. If you don't recommend treatment or treatment isn't going to be provided, then an individual recovery plan does not need to be completed. Okay, this section is best demonstrated by demonstrating it. So treatment diagnosis. Now, in this case, let's see here. If it's, okay, so in the case of this John Tester assessment, I'm going to select Create New. We're going to pretend like this is an intake assessment. If this was an intake assessment with a client who had not had a diagnosis, you would not see this section. So you would just be presented with this upcoming screen here. Okay. If it was a reassessment, you can select Create Copy. I'll go through those steps on the PowerPoint here in a second. So some things that you need to do before you enter an assessment. You're going to edit this. You want to make sure that, you know, if for some reason you're filling this BHA, this part of the BHA in after the assessment was actually completed, you just want to make sure that this date corresponds to the date that the diagnosis was provided, which at the BHA. So it should match the BHA date. And you want to make sure here that you select Assessor Georgia Hope. This is for an intake assessment. Now, if this was a client who had a previous diagnosis, this is say a reassessment that you're doing, you would want to select the date, whatever it was, that diagnosis was provided originally. So you're going to have to do some checking beforehand. And then you're going to select whoever provided that diagnosis. So maybe it was Brandy Kelly, and she provided that diagnosis on the 3rd of September. Now, that's if it's a reassessment. The client has an external diagnosis. You can add that here. And you can put external diagnosis by and whoever provided that diagnosis. To actually enter the diagnosis, the quickest thing to do, so here's where you actually add the diagnosis. So you put that there, click on that. If it's, say, for instance, I'm looking for depression, I'll type the first few letters in, hit my tab button, and it tells me there are 50 different depression diagnoses, which is still less than having to look through the entire DSM. And so you're going to select the appropriate diagnosis. So let's say this is a client with major depressive disorder, single episode. And that may pop up down here, some ICD-9. You're going to select whatever is the most appropriate for the ICD-9 code. This part is not as important. It's getting this right and making sure that corresponds to your ICD-10 down here. It should be the same thing. And submit. Okay. Some peculiarities with, so this is first time diagnosis. I went through that with you. This is a reassessment. You're going to use that create copy option, so it'll pull forward whatever the current official diagnosis is. when you do create copy, you're going to click on this drop down and you're going to select whoever provided that most recent official diagnosis. And you're still going to have to go in and update this information because it always defaults to you as the person who provided the diagnosis. Okay, and we've gone through that. We're into the final two sections here. So this tiers and protocols, the tier section of the BHA is really just a quick way to identify what level of care the client might need. It also helps somewhat with population management. So we know that if we have a lot of, you know, we can do a report and pull the number of tier 2 clients we have, the number of tier 3 clients we have. Ooh, I don't know where that came from. And this also, when you get to the individual recovery plan, will allow you to enter some information on providing the frequency and intensity of services. Okay, not sure what's going on with my screen here.
I can barely hear this.
Okay, so people are you're having problems hearing me?
It's okay.
Okay, I'm not sure why my screen is drawing pink things on it like that. Let me stop sharing for a second.
I think that was me.
Okay. Okay, let's go back here. See. Okay, there we go. Yes, this it uses information from the BHA to make this tier selection. So it's fairly simple to use. It's just a matter of selecting yes and no questions. So in fact, it'd probably be easier to show you this in the BHA itself. So this, okay, so this is the tier selection module. So of course, first you have to select whether the client meets criteria for services, and that means they have an eligible mental health diagnosis and they have a need for services. If they're not eligible for services, you click no, that all goes away, and you're not going to do an IRP. If they are eligible, so you're going to go through these one level at a time. They have an eligible mental health diagnosis. Okay, yes. Do they have a substance use diagnosis? If they have a substance use diagnosis, they are automatically in tier 2. If you select, if they had at least one chronic illness, no hospitalization. No. So whatever the highest level is where you've answered a question yes, that's the tier that they will be assigned to. And so when you get to the individual recovery plan, it gives you a place where you're going to select that tier. And that's what you're going to put, you're going to make that selection based on what was selected here. And what's in these tiers, basically, it just gives us a picture of increasing levels of need for services. It also incorporates the fact that we're an integrated care provider and we're concerned about things like homelessness. We're concerned about things like hospitalization, about chronic illness. So that's the primary reason for, those are the primary reasons for using that tier selection. And it's just as simple as answering each one of these questions, either yes or no, and then referring back to that when you get to the individual recovery plan. So transition discharge plan has been updated a bit. You're going to make a selection. So if this is an intake, at intake, you're going to make a estimation about when this current level of treatment concludes, what's going to happen to the client. So when they're, whatever level of services we're recommending for them at this point, when they get to the end of that, will they step down, or transition to other services, or will they discharge from all services? What do we think? Do they just need brief 3 to 6 months of treatment and then they're going to discharge? Or are they starting with an intensive level of services and then they're going to step down to a less intensive level of services? So depending on what you select up here, you can see that affects what appears down here at the bottom. So if we're anticipating that they're going to discharge, we want to put a date by which we think they're going to discharge. Typically, this is a 6-month time frame. It may be more or less based on your clinical judgment, but if you put 6 months, that's going to be good. I'm going to come back to the slide to explain what goes into this outcomes box. But if they're discharging from all services and they're going to get medication management by their primary care doc, fine. If they're going to discharge to natural supports, you have to explain what those natural supports are. Who are they? And this is different from how this used to be configured. And how will those supports be maintained? So if it's family and friends, you can say family and friends, but what are the family and friends going to do to help that client maintain their recovery? So hopefully that makes sense. If you select discharge or transition to other services, rather, say they're getting group, they're getting individual, they're getting CSS, but they're going to step down to just individual once you select that. So the only thing you have to explain further is the natural or other supports. Okay, so let me scroll through these and get down to, so I do want to take the time, and I apologize, we really need to schedule this as a 2.5-hour training, I think. Transition discharge plan. So that main text box in the middle, when you're entering the criteria that will indicate that the client's ready to discharge or transition, you need to be specific. So how long is it going to take them to get to the point where they're ready to transition? 3 months of mastering certain skills, whatever. What are the concrete criteria that they will achieve that indicate that they're ready to move on? And make sure that these are not just generic words that you're putting there. They'll complete their goals and objectives of the IRP with 85% certainty. That's not acceptable. They need to be specific to the client. And, here's a hint. If you have an IRP with good goals and objectives in it, you can kind of just rewrite those goals and objectives into this transition plan. Or you can take, if you've written it well in the transition plan, you may just be able to copy paste with some editing over into the individual recovery plan. So all that should, hopes for recovery, individual recovery plan, and transition plan should all pretty closely reflect each other in terms of the criteria that are included there. And so here you have an example, and I've color-coded the parts of this transition discharge plan. So Johnny's going to transition to community supports, family, friends, when for a period of 4 months, he reports he's comfortably able to spend time with friends 3 to 4 times a week, and he uses the positive self-calming skills he's learned at least 80% of the time when he feels himself becoming anxious. So we could look at that and know when that's completed. Now keep in mind, the community supports is going to be explained in a little more detail in that natural other supports box that appears as part of this transition plan. Okay, and I think there were some other documents that I wanted to get to as part of this training, but I think we're going to save those for, and we'll do them real quick at the beginning of the individual recovery plan training next week. But I do want to just give you some reminders again about signatures. So make sure when you start the document group, if you have a good idea of whether this client has substance use, you're going to want to select Anna Fortune as the person who will review that BHA when it's completed. Otherwise, you'll select Samantha Chaplin. BHAs and IRPs, the same document group. Make sure you send them to the same person for co-signature. And all IRPs where there's an substance use diagnosis, again, make sure that those go to Anna Fortune as well. You don't need to send the service plan development or surveys or the PCP information form to anybody for second signature. Okay, so let me do an edit here just a second, and I'm going to pop up where you go for the quiz that you'll need to complete as part of this process. Okay, and I think I have that, and Christine will correct me if I'm wrong here. Oh, well, hang on a minute. Okay, so let me share my screen again. And Christine is going to send out a link for this quiz, but I want to give you, you'll see the password here. This is the only time you'll see this password. So remember it. Okay. So Christine's going to send out the link to this quiz. Here's your password for the quiz. I'm assuming I got that right. Yeah, thanks. I appreciate that. And you have to, in order to get your CE certificate, and correct me if I'm wrong on this, Christine, but in order to get your CE certificate, you have to complete this quiz within the next week. Once that week has expired, the CE certificate will be pulled down and will not be available any longer, because we don't want that to be accessed outside of having viewed this live webinar. So thanks to everybody for your participation today. I will see you, make sure the password is case sensitive, as Christine mentioned. And Christine, any details that to share about the IRP workshop next week?
I'll put those in the email. There's instructions for what you guys need to do for the quiz and for the survey in the email. I tried to make it as pretty straightforward as possible. So if you guys will just make sure to read the email fully and follow the instructions, it should be pretty easy and self-explanatory.